Welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I am the artistic director at the Writers Center. More importantly for today, I'm also a fiction writer and a novelist, so that's why I get this tremendous honor of talking with our guest, Maggie Sheffer, about The Man in the Banana Trees, a wonderful story collection and winner of the Iowa Short Fiction Award, an incredibly deserving book for that award as well. So Maggie, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have a copy of the book handy, could you just read us a short excerpt so people will know what we're talking about for the rest of the evening?
Sure. Thank you for the kind words and for hosting, Zach. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's so great to see everyone or see your names. I'm going to read just the opening of a short story called Mouse Number 6, just a few paragraphs. I roll my shoulders and touch my toes, getting limber in preparation for my death. When I die, I will bend my back and flop my arms, knock my knees and shiver my heels against the sticky floor so it can be seen from the back mezzanine. Let's be honest, the Nutcracker is a ballet for children, and children want to revel in my demise. It has to be so over the top, it goes beyond scary and back to funny again. I am double booked this year, my two biggest parts yet, Clara for the even nights and the Mouse King for the odd. Clara is the resume builder, a real pretty, facey part, my blonde hair half up, my face made rosy with blush. I'm grateful for the opportunity, I say. These are our big money-making shows of the year. For 2 weeks in December, we get a live orchestra and whole families in shiny shoes. Kids gawk at the big crystal chandelier in the lobby when it winks at them during intermission. After 11 years, finally, there's a bigger-than-life poster of me as Clara in the red velvet lobby, cradling the Nutcracker doll to my chest. But on show nights, honestly, I relish the role of the Mouse King more. Rambunctious rapscallion is more fun to play than Clara's little girl innocence. I exaggerate every gesture. I vamp. From within my foam head and eye netting, the audience is a dark hearth, reduced to silence or tittering or cheers. I'll do anything to make them laugh. I'll scurry and tumble. I'll pounce. I'll lead my minions into the fray. The mice are local 2nd to 4th graders bused here twice a week for cultural enrichment. The San Antonio Boys and Girls Club has partnered with our regional ballet company to deposit the kids here from 4 to 8 to keep them off the streets. Boys and Girls provides the snacks, the transportation, and the additional supervision of Laura, the chaperone. Most of the company feigns exasperation, but it's invigorating how new all of this is to the mice, the velvet of the seats, the echo of the stage, the bright lights. With them, I'm elevated from a tired 20-something into a wise ambassador. Lara, the chaperone, is hushing Rudy and Q, who are hitting each other with their long tails and making lightsaber noises. Q slices his tail into Rudy's neck, and Rudy clutches at his throat. He dies epically, just like I've taught them. A little gurgle, limp wrists and elbow, stumbling forward, lolling head. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I know you were reading, so you didn't notice that we were celebrating the story and celebrating the story in the chat a little bit. It's a popular one, so. Yeah, so in your own words, who the heck are you?
I'm Maggie. I live in New Orleans now. I lived in Oakland for about 10 years before that. I was a high school English teacher for all of those 10 years. And now I mostly write and teach. I'm also an Air Force brat, so I've lived lots of different places and have a complicated idea of where home is. Yeah. And I still feel a lot of imposter syndrome about calling myself a writer. So being here at the Writers Center is really exciting.
No imposter syndrome ever. I mean, always, but it's not never justified. So the first question that we like to ask our guests, or at least I do, is where does thinking about the craft of writing fall into your process? In other words, when are you most aware of the more mechanical parts of writing? Is that when are you more like free-flowing or intuitive, or are you more rigid in thinking, and when does that kind of thinking differ and vary, and what parts of the process?
Yeah, I love this question. I think for me, my initial drafts have to be free flowing and intuitive. I'm a big shit rough drafter. I have draft zeros. I'll write shit rough draft right at the top because for me, the first draft has to feel really low stakes and it has to be free to be as bad as it wants to be and be as wrong as it needs to be to really uncover what the draft is about. And when I think about craft, I often think about experimenting because if I'm, say, well, I think of craft as a series of choices, and it often takes me a very long time to figure out what the right choices are for a particular piece. Like if I'm thinking of point of view, it's not that I jump right to the correct answer, it's that I try a lot of them and try to feel what feels most right for the story. So I go through many, 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 many drafts to do that. And try to go beyond my initial impulse. But I do tend to think of craft, especially with the stories in this book, as experimenting, of trying some things outside of my comfort zone or trying to break some craft rules and seeing what I could get away with, seeing what happened when I did that. I can think of many, many stories where the tense changed from draft to draft, the POV changed from draft to draft, the voice changed from draft to draft. So it's not something that I choose in advance, but something that I uncover by trying it out.
That's, I mean, I certainly uncover while trying, but my own process is definitely like I got to have something in that first draft. I don't usually come back to it. Like I try. There's something essential gotten. So I always love talking to writers who have that sort of opposite process, for me, and are much more willing to. I have to get some sort of flow going on the first draft, to feel like it goes somewhere where I don't have interest in going to the next step if that doesn't happen early on. So it's write how you want to write. That's the lesson right here.
Can I say one more quick thing
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that?
sure, sure.
I've realized for me that I often find like the challenge is what keeps me coming back of having something that I want to figure out how to do, but it almost feels at the edge of my skill or right at the edge of my intelligence. And I'm like, I don't know if I can actually do this. But that's the thing that excites me enough to come back to the next draft and keep plugging away at it. Because some of the stories in this book have like 30, 40, 50 versions when I go back to my Google Drive.
And I shouldn't say, I mean, I'm the same by the end, but like I want to, I guess I tweak a lot and less like wholesale large scale revision. Um, so let's talk structure a little bit because I think every story in this collection really delivers a sense of satisfaction. And I do think that's in part due to the story's overall structures. However, there are some examples of stories that don't have a standard narrative arc, and that's always really interesting to me when something feels like it moves forward, when it feels like it delivers a moment of satisfaction, where we're not maybe not pointing to a traditional climax, what we would point to in a story arc. So, what do you think structure is? Big question. And what makes a particular story and story shape satisfying?
Yeah, I love that you use the word shape because I do think of structure as shape. And there can be some really non-traditional shapes that still achieve that like balance, like a Calder mobile or something where they still balance out. How do I think about structure? I think for me, I like to think about genre a lot and play around with genre and steal other people's forms and write stories into them. One of the stories in this book, the title story, "The Man in the Banana Trees," was written pretty immediately after I read Carmen Maria Machado's book In the Dream House. And I keep thinking people are going to call me on having directly stolen her structure. It's a totally different story. But she was doing this amazing thing with fragmented, numbered sections that spoke to each other and had kind of a fairy tale vibe. And I wanted to try it out and see what happened. And this was one of the stories that came up. So I'm really inspired by poets. I'm glad you mentioned them at the beginning and the way they'll try a sestina or invent a form and try to write within it. Because I think for me, sometimes story structure, like a prompt or like a genre, is the container that you can play around in that gets me unstuck and feeling a little bit less precious. I don't have to invent it. I can steal it or borrow it or adapt it.
And I think too, it can be completely random. I mean, it's a metaphor. The shape is a
Yeah.
metaphor. So choose them. I mean, and metaphors are flexible and not real. So you can just choose any sort of shape metaphor you want and see what happens, playing
Mhm.
with it. So yeah, I love that.
And a
Um,
lot of the stories, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
A lot of the stories in the book are flash, and flash is really fun to do with form. There's some that have big time jumps and things. And I think that I really like the challenge of trying to jump 1,000 years in a flash story in 1,000 words. So things like that kind of get my juices flowing and thinking about writing in a different way.
Yeah. So are there any specific things you're looking for during that really, really rough draft or through the revision process in terms of developing that sense of forward motion and a sense of resolution? Are there like, is there anything you can talk about more concretely about what those moments are or what that sense of motion is?
Yeah, I think often I'm writing to uncover the ending and then I have to go way back to the beginning. But I have spent a long time studying endings in other people's fiction and trying to figure out for myself what makes a good ending. I've always loved stories that have a twist that doesn't feel false, that feels really earned. And I think one thing I'm really proud of is in this collection is that the endings were really careful, and I think that that's the strength of it. But yeah, when I would write to uncover the ending and then be like, oh, that's what the story is really about. Everything needs to move towards that. And then that's when the draft would really take off and I could start to revise with confidence because I knew where it was actually going. And then I'd have to seed different things earlier. Often the ending would totally change the opening because I'd want to kind of reflect it in that way. So one concrete craft tip is to figure out the ending and then work from there, especially with that opening paragraph, right?
Yeah, but I love the idea. Figuring out the ending though is part of the process of drafting. And
Yeah.
I know authors who do sort of know where they're going earlier than say I do. But again, I think it's that that idea of like writing as a process to figure out the ending, and that can occur at any point. It can occur in the outlining process. It can occur like, oh, I've had stories where I like was really like, oh, I'm at the ending. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know that was I'm here. Oh, that's it. Okay, good. And done. So
Yeah.
yeah, it can literally occur at any point in the writing process. So that's really great. You mentioned you had borrowed a form from Carmen Marie Machado, but are there any other authors you look to for inspiration in this area of forward motion and satisfaction and resolution?
Definitely, yes. Meg Ellison, who's a science fiction author,
Yes.
has incredible endings and forward momentum. And I had the pleasure of hearing her speak once, and she said something very similar to what I just said of like stories going fiercely towards the ending with as little fluff as possible. So then the hard part is figuring out what is the fluff versus what's essential to make the ending land. That can be a real judgment call. She's really wonderful. Ken Liu, who also writes kind of literary sci-fi. Um, a book I just read, The Safekeep, has an incredible ending. And it's one of those where all the pieces suddenly click when you know what's really happening. But many, many authors, I studied quite a lot to try to get under the hood and figure out what made endings work. Because prior to that, a lot of my writing had been just kind of like vibey, imagey, kind of like a music video, but it didn't really have that momentum and plot structure. And I think that's beautiful. A lot of beautiful writing does that. But I know that the books I love the most personally have like a plot and a zinger ending. And I wanted to be able to do that when I wanted to.
It would be a really fascinating essay to read about your process of this research and study and analysis. So I'm just
Yeah.
a request on the sidelines. I would read that essay. So please consider it.
I
Um,
would.
yeah. So you mentioned a couple sci-fi authors there. So I'm going off script a little bit, and I am interested then that you obviously there are maybe genres, but you don't necessarily aren't thinking in terms of strict genre divides. So what is genre and why does it matter? Can we ask that broad a question?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Yeah.
I think genre is a set of story expectations that can include everything from setting to the plot to who the characters are. Um, and I think that some of the fun of genre is subverting it. But I do think that there's again, I think of it as a container, right? Like the way poets work in form. It gives you something, some decisions come pre-made. That's not to say that you can't change them, but you're like working with some of the dials already clicked into place so that you can focus your creative attention on a limited amount of choices at a time. I also think if you're trying to get certain ideas across, you some genres lend themselves to that exploration better. One reason I love reading and writing science fiction is that I'm really interested in morals and politics and power dynamics. But I feel that they're so complex in the real world, but science fiction lets me isolate one and make a hypothetical and kind of make a fake world. It's almost like making a fake scenario to play out a real situation, but I don't need to feel like I'm doing a disservice to all the complexities of the real world. So I think that certain genres lend themselves to exploring different themes really well. And science fiction happens to be one of the ones I know the best.
Mhm. And it's interesting too, then, but you're also a highly literary, quote unquote, whatever that means, writer.
Yeah.
But it feels like I'm thinking now pulling in genre elements is a way of subverting literary expectations. So bringing in that love and knowledge of other genres ends up working that subversive factor in literary fiction. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
interesting.
I think it's an exciting moment for us genre fiction nerds because the barriers that had existed previously between horror magazines and literary magazines are kind of falling down. And there's an acknowledgement that you can write literary horror and that a lot of horror that is published in horror magazines is actually quite literary if you go check it out. So if
Genres
anyone
are
here,
made up.
well, I don't quite agree with that because I think they can be useful, but
Yeah.
I think the boundaries aren't actually real. Like, I think if anything, if the box office movies show us anything, it's that far more people are interested in science fiction and fantasy and escapism than we might have previously thought.
Mhm. Great, thank you. So related to genre, in this sense a little bit is I was trying to figure out one of the things that about this collection that made it feel so united to me, because it
Mhm.
definitely feels like a cohesive whole. And I landed on the concept of wonderment.
Mm.
There's some stories that are more or less realist in here, um, and others that are firmly speculative and fantastical. But for all of them, I sense that you, as a writer, are sort of searching for an angle that lets you be curious about your subjects. And I feel like you want to enter that state of wonder and share that state with the reader. Um, so first of all, does that interpretation resonate with you? And sort of the two-part question is, what draws you to a subject and how do you approach that subject maybe curiously or wonderingly to get at something that interests you within it in that sort of sense?
Yes, it definitely does resonate. I love that description. I think curiosity is one of the deepest forms of respect we can give to topics or people. So um, I love that. And I think that I've always loved puzzles and trying to figure things out. And the harder the puzzle, the more I'm enraptured with it. So I think that when I don't understand something, then I want to write about it. And it's not that when I finish a story, I understand it, but it's a way of just kind of falling into curiosity and embracing the mess and living with the questions. And there's, I think the reason that fiction is a great tool for dealing with complexity is that there's no right answer. And I think that unlike so many areas of my life, I never have to compromise when I'm writing fiction. I don't have to oversimplify things. I get to lean into the real complicated stuff. Um, and that's just really fun. Even when the topics are really dark, which a lot of them are for this book, it feels so freeing to not solve anything, but just really think about it.
Hmm. Thank you. That's great. I just want to remind everyone that we're absolutely welcome questions from the audience. If you have a question at any point, please put it into the chat window and I will get to as many of those as I can. It might not be right away, but I will keep an eye out and get to them as we go along. So please add your questions as well. So I think we're segueing really nicely into this next question is uh, the concept of thinking on the page. So when I
Mm.
was going back through, I don't know if people saw my copy of the book. I do put tabs in books when I read of things I want to return to or stories I want to like maybe reference as something I teach from myself. But a lot of my tabs were little bits of narratorial wisdom. And I realized that that's sort of against the old show don't tell thing. This is a point where I'm sort of being told something concretely or being shared an idea, a concept, or something elaborated on in very clear, like philosophical almost terms. So, for example, in The Observer's Cage, another one of the stories I really loved in the collection, there was the line, "Funny how so short a span so long ago can be the hinge you swing open on like an enormous door." I mean, we're firmly in the head of a narrator, and I can't remember the point of view of that story off the top of my head, pardon me, but it might actually, we're either in the character's head via the narrator or directly in the character's head through the perspective. I can't remember which one. And within other stories, you have other variations of that same sort of entry. So this got me thinking that we don't really ever talk about lines like this in terms of craft. I don't really know that people are writing about craft in that way. So, except sometimes negatively, that this might be a kill your darling moment. Like, oh, you thought in the page, cut that, you don't need that. But then so much in this book that I wanted to remember were those moments. So how do you view those moments yourself? And how do you integrate them so they blend with, as opposed to maybe stand out from the rest of the text on the page?
Yeah, I've never been a believer in the kill your darlings, actually. Not that I haven't heard that advice, but I think, again, when I'm early drafting, I have to kind of let it all out. And then it's only late in the process. I'll try to pull it back. And I love my darlings. I tend to keep them, but I think you have to earn them. And that's what I will say. So I think that if a character is just going to drop some wisdom, they have to have earned it. It can't seem like the writer's like, I'm so smart, I'm just dropping this bomb in. And I think for that example you gave from that story, it takes the character a while to get to that revelation. They go through some memories, they go through kind of early versions of that thought. Um, and I think, yeah, I write a lot in third, close third, and first because I am interested in letting characters unleash their full intelligence on those puzzles I mentioned earlier, right? Like I'm interested in them making mistakes and being human, but also thinking pretty deeply about things. And I don't really want to do a disservice to them by shortchanging their wisdom. Even if they're doing all the wrong things, they're still thinking and noticing and coming right up to a revelation and then stepping back. That's one of my favorite things in stories, seeing people who are almost there and they can't quite get there. Um, I don't know if that quite answers your question. I do think I like pretty plot heavy stories. So I think that plot and thinking go hand in hand because I think in my life, I'm constantly thinking about what's happening and that changes my action. And then my action has an impact. And then that, a sequence of events. Sometimes I find that if not enough is happening, I'm not giving my characters enough to bounce their thoughts off of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's actually good because I was thinking one thing that struck me was that there's an integration factor in that those moments are in communication with what's around them.
Yes.
And that's, I think, and that is, I think, one of the, as you were talking, like, that's the thing too, because the earning it idea
Mhm.
is also like part of earning it is making sure that they're not standing alone, that they're part of something bigger and contributing to, like, they're contributing to something bigger as opposed to just being a good thought standing alone.
Yes. And I think I love essayists. I am not an essayist. I think reading a string of thoughts or writing a string of thoughts would be really challenging for me to make cohesive. But I think there's something interesting about like an image, a plot, a symbol, the mysteriousness of that is really attractive to me, which is another reason I like stories. So having a character who's thinking about what the story they're in means, I love that.
Going to turn to the chat window now. I have our first couple questions coming in. The first one is from Hannah, who is an instructor at the Writer Center. So, hi, Hannah. Why should more people read short story collections? What do short stories give us that novels might not?
Mm. Ooh, I want to know your answer to this question too, Hannah. Hi, Hannah. I am such a short story nerd. They're one of my very favorite genres. I read so many short stories. I think a thing I love about a short story collection is that it's a chorus, it's a kaleidoscope. You can approach the same thing from different angles in a way that you can't necessarily with a novel. Um, I also think if your goal is thought provoking and provoking unease, which mine often is, in the shorter form, you kind of just get to like stab and twist, if that makes sense. You get to like give people a little bit of you get to leave them hanging a little bit, and leave them unsettled and introduce something that they then have to go unpack. But because you have such little real estate, being provocative rather than being fully I don't know if that's the right word. Maybe novel writers would say this is exactly what they do too. But as someone who's written a lot of short stories, I want to give people just enough so that they can't stop thinking about it. I don't want them to be settled.
Yeah. Thank you. Back to the chat window. Can you please talk about deadlines in the writing process?
Yeah, I love a deadline. I will submit to pretty much any contest, even if I feel woefully underprepared and I have to rush to get something done. And then I will get the rejection, and then I will keep working on the story after that. But I feel like deadlines get me to stop being precious about my work and just get it on the page, get me going. I often miss them, but I still find that deadlines get me producing more than I would in a world without deadlines. So it's kind of this constant push-pull. There's a story right now that I rushed to finish for a deadline, got the rejection, but I'm so proud of where it is right now, where it wouldn't be otherwise, that I'm definitely going to spend the next 3 years working on it. That's a common story for me, is like draft something in a month that's totally not ready, but then spend years and years revising it after that point. And the question was also about publishing advice,
Yeah,
right?
there's a second part would be, and also any publishing tips.
Yeah. I think don't self-reject, and learning to love rejection has been a huge part of my own journey. Sorry, my dog is barking. I have to shush her one second. Sorry, she's still loud. I've gotten 500 rejections in the last 4 years on the stories in this book. Many of them came after the book was already accepted for publication. So rejection is just a constant part of my publishing journey. And I'm really grateful for that. I learned a ton about publishing via rejection. Many of them were warm rejections. I developed relationships with editors. I had the experience once where I submitted something for a contest. It got rejected, but then the person who rejected it reached out to me personally and said they wanted to include that story in an anthology, and I never would have made that connection elsewise. So like, you just don't know. And please put your work out there. I also think, and this goes for writing and publishing, but having a writing group is so helpful for trying to figure out if your work is ready to go, things like that. I mean, I could talk all day about writing groups. We could talk for the next hour.
Well, maybe we'll come back to it. If
Yeah.
we have some time at the end, have a little more writing group talk.
Yeah.
So back to the chat window. What's your emotional relationship to writing a novel versus short stories versus essays? Are you writing a novel anytime soon?
I am working on a novel right now. I need to come and go from it because it's hard to maintain that harsh. It's hard to it's hard to maintain. Is that too loud for you guys? Just let me
No,
know.
it's we're not really noticing.
Okay. So classic. She doesn't do this normally, and then as soon as there's an important Zoom. Yeah, with a novel, I feel like short stories are so satisfying and addictive, and I'm often cheating on my novel with short stories. That happens quite a lot. They're so much fun, and I almost can't put them down. On the other side of that, the novel, it's it's kind of like a marriage, to extend the cheating analogy. Like, it's always there. I'm coming back to it. I love it very, very much. It's frustrating sometimes. I need to take some time away from it sometimes to remind me why I love it so much.
Great, thank you. So I'm interested in this next question from the chat window. Do you find it hard to let go of a character after writing a short story?
No, no, that's an interesting question. I love that question. I think that might be a sign that I need to write a novel. But I really enjoy the brief flashes into the character that short stories do give me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was asked about a sequel to my novel, and I'm like, it had never literally crossed my mind that Like, these characters existed for this thing. Why would I do another
Yeah.
thing with them?
Yeah, yeah. I have had the experience though of having a short story that just wouldn't quit and it kept growing, and that's now my novel. So I
Oh,
tried
yeah,
tried to keep it a short story and it refused.
yeah.
So that
That's a
that I
good
think.
that's a good feeling though. That's how you want the novel to happen, is like, oh, I got to keep writing.
Yeah.
All right, back to the chat window. How much do you aim to write in one sitting? What does your writing schedule look like?
Ooh, yeah. By necessity, I have a 2-year-old and a day job. So right now my writing schedule is very scattered. I always am working to find more writing time, but I've definitely had to adapt to writing in 10 or 15-minute chunks sometimes, ideally 1 to 2 hours. But some hacks I have found to get into and out of writing really quickly are I do a lot of listing. When I can't really fully get into a piece, I'll stop and list ideas, and that gets my brain going. I will also use something called the Most Dangerous Writing app. I don't know if anyone here has ever used that, but I love it. My friend Danny Terry Jr., who's an amazing writer, introduced me to it. But you can say, what you do is you open it in your browser, you set a timer, say for 5 minutes. And if at any point in that 5 minutes you stop producing words or you go back to edit, it will delete everything you've written. So it
That's
forces
a
you to
nightmare.
just,
That's a nightmare.
it
That's a
sounds
nightmare.
like it, but I would recommend everyone to try it once. You never have to do it again. But every time I've done it, I'm like, this is the time. It's not going to work. I have no ideas. But then I want to save it at the end. I'm so desperate not to lose it because there's something that comes up and it gets me unstuck. It gets me going. It gets me generating material that I can later then revise.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Going back to the chat window, how do you feel about old school science-oriented science fiction writers? For example, Larry Niven, Jerry Pournelle, Gregory Benford versus more character-oriented sci-fi writers. Ray Bradbury seem to be more character-oriented with his stories. Do you feel one is better than the other?
Better, I don't know. I just think it's a taste question. I love both. Ray Bradbury is one of my OG like favorites, though. His work is so beautiful and wonderful to me, and that was my introduction to science fiction. So I would have to say that's my taste. I think there's a lot of writers doing a lot. Recently, I've read a lot more hard sci-fi that's in the vein of like solar punk or climate fiction. So these are writers who are in some ways teaching real scientific concepts by building stories around them. And I find that incredibly exciting because there's a lot of real impactful science right now that stories can be getting across.
Hmm, thank you.
Yeah,
So how do you determine when an idea is good for Flash or for a conventional short story?
great question.
Mhm.
I try to write things as short as I can get away with. I have a lot of failed flash pieces where I tried to do them in 1,000 words and they ended up being 3 or 6,000. So I don't usually know the answer going in. Ricky, the first story in the collection, was trying to be Flash, and it just was a bigger idea. It couldn't do it. But I think a general rule of thumb, I think a lot about the idea of minimum viable story, of how short can I get it, and it still works. It still floats as a story. And that to me helps me figure out what is absolutely essential to the story. And it's not that it's like just plot summary, but sometimes an image or a character or something, it is essential. I definitely lean short though. I like the challenge of writing as short as possible. Microfiction, like 250 words. I did a lot of those challenges early on in the drafting for these stories. And I think it taught me a lot about what I think makes a good story. Because how do you write a story in 250 words? It's like a lot of economy.
Yeah. So you get the phrase right, minimal viable story.
Yeah, my day job is in the design thinking world, and they have this idea of like minimum viable product, meaning like how can you launch something into the world and have it function with as little bells and whistles and being as like underbaked as possible, but still doing the thing, still delivering on the promise. So I think with stories, the question is like, what's the minimum viable story version of that story? What delivers on the promise of the story in as little time as possible?
That's really fascinating. Again, I'm asking for another essay. So if you could write that one, I'm asking you to write a whole essay collection of craft essays that I may read.
Thank you. Yeah. It's definitely helped me a lot. Not that I'm not writing longer, but that it's helped me figure out like what is the juice of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. It's not that I would think I would want to write a minimal viable story as you described it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the most appealing thing. It's just a benchmark and lets you
Yeah.
identify something essential. And I like excess and random, and I want a little mess in stuff I read, or at least stuff I write. So
Yeah.
I'm
Sabrina
never
or
gonna be minimal viable.
Sabrina or Remark has a cool flip on this idea where she has someone write a story and then write a like much shorter version of the same story and then a much longer version of the same story and see how it changes. I think that's really interesting
Yeah,
too.
great, thank you. Um, Back to the chat. It sounds like you have a few different stories at different stages. How do you decide which one to pick up on a particular day or week?
Ooh, I kind of have to follow my energy and interest. A lot of my stories are in the drawer meaning they're like on ice for long periods of time. I think I have like 10 right now that are just in some form of doneness. Um, but because I have such little time to work on writing on a daily basis, I have to really enjoy it. It has to be the thing that feels most fun. It has to be that thing that I was up at 3 a.m. thinking about and want to get the ideas down on. Because I'm just not going to do it if it's not fun. Um, and again, I like challenge fun. So I don't have a very structured way of doing this. The caveat to that, though, is I mentioned earlier, I love a deadline. So a deadline will help me move something up or down the pile.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I'm through all the current questions in the chat, but please keep them coming. I'll turn back there in a minute if more come through. So one thing I want to talk about stories was the tone and the voice, etc. I really like that there's a sort of clarity of tone for each individual story, and that they each have their own voice and feel too. So there's well-established tone, well-established voice per story, and there's not like a repetition of a singular voice throughout the different stories. There's nothing wrong with that sometimes, but I do appreciate it when when an author has that command of tone and voice in such a way that each one resonates differently, has a different pitch, a different key, however you want to, whatever musical metaphor you want to claim. Um, so what's the difference for you between the tone of an individual story and maybe your sort of default tone as a writer?
Mm, that's a great question. I journal a lot, so I feel like I do have a sense of what my default tone is. I think one of the earliest stages of the drafting process for me is figuring out how to like getting into that voice, trying it out, trying a few different voices, figuring out what character, because I do have a pretty traditional view on endings, which is that most stories either involve change or someone coming right up to change and then running away from it. So I try to figure out like who is that person who is in that change on the precipice of change, and then what is their voice like? Yeah. And that I think is where some of the woo-woo stuff happens, the magic. I heard someone describe writing as like mechanics and magic, and I don't know what else to say about where the voices come from. It does kind of feel like being possessed in the best way. But it's almost like you set yourself up for it by thinking about like deeply about who the people are in this situation. What would they notice? What are their fears? What are their hopes? What are they not noticing is a question I ask myself quite a lot. Like, what is the thing they're deliberately not wanting to see? Um, yeah.
So there's the magical part, and I'm totally cool with some things being magical in writing, and also I'm
Yeah.
totally cool with like what's magical being different for different writers.
Yeah.
But is there a point where you recognize the tone that's happened and then take steps to enhance or reinforce or extend that tone
Yeah.
through the revision process?
I do think that's true. Definitely. I'm going to use the observer's cage again because you mentioned that story earlier. That narrator in particularly is like an 80-year-old man. He's reflecting back on his life. He's really poetic, and other characters in the story even make fun of him for it. So that was a fun exercise as a writer to like just let the language go off and be more decorative than I normally would, because that's just how he is. Whereas there's other stories where another narrator is maybe grieving and doesn't want to see the things and is just writing in more short staccato observations with like not trying to let the emotion in.
Mhm. That's great. And I love sort of the concept of tone as an exercise. You just sort of set yourself, I want to do tone in this tone and see what happens. And that's actually a great way to push yourself out of default, your default writing
Yeah.
mode a little bit. Yeah.
And I think tone can be great for showing change too, right? Like the register doesn't have to stay the same. You're not breaking character. It's often like someone will have a revelation or face the thing they didn't want to face, and they will show a different side of the same voice.
I love it when an author can pull off like a final paragraph, final couple paragraph tone change of especially like a first person or a close third person narrator where like it's completely believable that this person shifted from I think Steve Almond's story, God Bless America, is the one I always quote on this, where it goes from the guy's kind of a goober, but at the end he has like this very legitimately earned tonal shift into a sort of reflective. And again, it's third person close, so it's the narrator's intervening a little bit. Anyway, not too much about that story, but I love that so much. Back to we have another question coming in. Speaking of points of view, any tips for writing the third person plural? Very selfishly, I'm trying it on for a piece and I'm finding it very challenging. So any third person plural advice?
Ooh, that's they, right? They do this, they do that. Um, yeah. Um, I don't think have I tried that one? That's a good question. I'd love to know what you're finding challenging about it if you want to give me a little bit more detail. I do think that knowing the reason why you want to do it or making sure that the premise fits the voice is really essential. So, just off the top of my head, if you're writing third person plural, it has a lot of distance. So, is it distant in time? Is the narrator actually, related to the events at hand at all? Sophia Samatar does a really cool thing in some of her stories where a lot of her characters are academics. So they are an individual person, but they'll be using third person plural because they're like writing a history of something, like the Mennonites did blah, 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 blah. But there's still a character, there's still a voice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. What are some of your favorite story collections? What should we be reading?
Yeah, so Sophia Samatar's Tender is really incredible. I just referenced that one. She's one of my very favorite writers. She's a historian and a science fiction writer and kind of merges those two. Um, Anything by Ted Chiang or Ken Liu. I just read There Is a Rio Grande in Heaven by Ruben Reyes Jr. That's an amazing short story collection that came out this year and is up for so many awards. It's really, really great. Um, I got to study with both Anjali Sachdeva and Claire Beams, who write amazing short story collections, and Maurice Carlos Ruffin has an amazing short story collection. So those are some of my teachers who I am so honored to know, and their work is amazing. I'll stop there because I could keep going, but I'll drop more in the chat when they come to me.
We might come back to that too. It might give you a round two of story collections.
Many, yeah.
Let's see. From the chat, thank you for this chat, Maggie. You're amazing and give so much to our writing community here in New Orleans, or there in New Orleans from my perspective. You have such a range of stories in this book. Where do your ideas come from? Where do you draw from? That's an interesting question for this book.
Yeah. That's a great question. Some of them came from my teaching experience, which a lot of them have to do with thoughts and conflicts that were unsettled from teaching. And then I also read a lot of nonfiction. To be very specific, there's a blog called katka.org. I will put it in the chat. Um, do, do, do that covers a lot of scientific developments, interesting art, interesting news. And I can say that several of the stories came directly out of things he was posting about, just nonfiction things. And I also have this habit of like having a coffee table book or like a textbook nearby and just kind of flipping through it. And that's how The Observer's Cage again came about, because I was working on another story that was an utter failure in the end. I never figured it out. But I happened to flip to a page in this astronomy textbook about the discovery of pulsars. And it was so interesting that a new story was born. So that's happened a few times with history books, other books, just reading in your interests, but really widely and not having a certain project in mind, just kind of following your own curiosities and reading nonfiction for me has been really wonderful, whether it's news articles, blogs, cereal boxes, whatever you happen to have nearby.
You mentioned the historical influence, and one of my questions I did want to ask was The Observer's Cage, and then going to ruin the evening by trying to say something in French, and Plein Air are inspired by or based on real history. So what about those historical events or perhaps other events makes you want to write a piece of fiction? So, and I guess in other words, what are you maybe looking for in history to inspire a story idea? What are the histories that lead to fiction?
Yeah. So both of those are kind of about hauntings. And I think my answer is a sense of unfinished business. Like something is not fully settled, something is not just. In the case of The Observer's Cage, it centers on this female astronomer who did discover pulsars, but did not receive the Nobel Prize while her male colleagues did. And to me, that instantly was like, well, fuck, that's really messed up, interesting. And while my story is very fictional, that seed of like some tension and unfinished business, specifically in the relationship between the people who had to be working so closely and then get kind of ripped apart by the credit for this amazing discovery, was really interesting to me. And then, of course, the story took a turn. And then in Plein Air, yes, it's definitely about a sense of unfinished business, inspired by some real historical events.
Yeah, what you mentioned they're very quickly moving off beyond what the history is. But
Yeah.
what is that process by which you turn a historical moment into a fiction narrative? How do you what parts are you fleshing out versus what parts are you just sort of pulling from the history?
Yeah. In both of those cases, I specifically changed the settings and the character names so they weren't the real people, which instantly gave me a lot of freedom to. There's a note in the back of the book explaining the connection for those who are curious, but I didn't want to feel the weight of representing real people's lives and experiences. I wanted the freedom to mess them up and change them for my purposes, like puppets. And also, I'm a fan of doing just enough research. So when I think I've got it, I close the book and I start making stuff up. And I don't worry about whether or not it's true or plausible or makes sense. Because I'm really just, I want the research to get me excited. And that's all. I don't want necessarily to worry about the size of the telescope being accurate or things like that. Because then it feels more like a chore. And that's the opposite of what I'm looking for.
That's great. Love it. Thank you. To the chat window, what's an example of somewhere you got stuck in one of your stories in this collection, and how did you find your way out?
Gosh, great question. Thanks, Jane. All of them at some point. I Mouse number 6 took years to finish. I'll talk about Tiger on My Roof, which is the final story in the collection. It had a different ending for quite a long time. It mostly just ended a few pages earlier. If you've read the story, you might be able to figure out what I'm talking about. But for those who haven't, I'll keep it a little bit more general. It, I was trying to, it's a story about grief, and I did not want to have any good answers at the end because it's a story about a young person being killed violently. There are no good answers, right? And I really, really want to not have any neat little bow at the end and have any pat on the back and it's like make it seem all okay. Um, and I was sitting on it and submitting it for a long time before finally going back and adding the last few pages. And I think one interesting thing about short stories and writing in general is that sometimes what's getting you stuck on a story is just your own growing up. In my case, like I needed to live a few more years of my life before I could finish the story. I need to experience a few more things. I didn't have it just hadn't happened in my life yet. And there was no skip ahead button that could have made me figure out the ending other than just like living and thinking and loving for a few more years.
I actually had a story too recently where I went back to it after a long, long time, and it was also I'd gotten better as a writer and was trying to
Mhm.
accomplish was actually probably better than I was, and I was
Mhm.
allowed to come back with like I'm a little better at language now, and I recognize the language intuited a lot of things and did okay, but I needed like the recognition of what I was doing to be able to go back and make the messed up part not messed up anymore. So that's
Yeah, yeah. I think that like we try to be efficient a lot of the time in writing, but I think one of the best things is that like you really can't be efficient. You have to just muddle. And the muddling is the good part.
just don't forget to go back to it eventually.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, just glancing back in the chat window. I think I'm caught up there. Um, I'll talk about detail a little bit as one of my favorite subjects in craft. So broadly, how does detail fit into your writing? When do the senses enter a scene? You've mentioned your drafting process. Do senses appear early in drafts, or is that something that once you get rough outline down, then you inhabit the thing you figured out a little more viscerally?
Yeah, pretty early, I would say. I mentioned that I'm a kind of a stream of consciousness rough drafter. And that does not come out as like outlines. It doesn't come out as things that are sensical. It comes out as really random details, some of which are like, make her a photographer. So at the premise level, and others which are like exact descriptions of caviar that make it into the final version. So I really just kind of like truly vomit it out. And then it's fascinating to me that like sometimes I wouldn't hold back from image in the early stages or sensory detail, because for me, sometimes that can really unlock it can unlock the bigger stuff for me. It doesn't, I don't go like big to small or small to big. I'm kind of jumping around, discovering both at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So someone asked about writing groups again, and we
Yeah.
skipped that over, and I want to give you at least a couple minutes here to talk writing groups. The
Sure.
question in the chat is any suggestions of writing groups which are supportive, but also what is the good of a writing group and what makes a writing group supportive?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate. I really clicked with two writers who went to my low residency MFA program at Randolph College, and we really vibed with each other's work. So we meet really regularly. I've also been part of writing groups that never met in person and have only communicated online. I did a program through Clarion West, which I didn't do the pay money attend in person version. I did like the online write-a-thon version. And they did this cool thing where they matched people up for 6 weeks to exchange flash work. And I found an amazing group of writers who we still talk to each other, and we would feedback on flash pieces initially, and we would share one every week. So we got that structure from Clarion West, and then we continued it. There are a lot of online venues for finding writing groups. I'm not as familiar with them, but I think what I love about writing groups is having a regular schedule of sharing work in progress with people whose work you also love, and getting exposed to their work in progress is also just a great muscle to build up. Seeing things that aren't finished yet, you can learn a whole lot, especially if you really trust the writer and know it's going to be good eventually. Kind of seeing different people's processes and seeing how they get unstuck can really help.
Great, thank you. In the chat, there's the question, are you an outliner or a pantser or a hybrid? I think we talked a little bit about your drafting process, but is there any level of outlining that precedes that initial exploratory drafting process?
Yeah, I'd consider myself a hybrid. I definitely don't outline at the start, but I generate a lot of material and then might go back to outline once I figure out the ending beat. I might go back to figure out, okay, what has to happen. My writing group recently did a genre challenge where we had to write in different genres. And the first one we did was murder mystery. And that definitely took an outline, which generated a lot of material, but I needed to figure out who was the murderer, all the clues, and there's no way, and I can't think of a way to do that without outlining. And then Matt Bell has this great tip about retyping things as part of your process. And I'm sorry to say it really, really, really works for me. I really didn't want to like it as much as I do, but he has this whole process where once you've made it through your second or third draft of something, just retyping the whole thing rather than revising it. And it's amazing what that does for my pieces.
If you want more on Matt Bell, he was a past Craft Chat guest discussing this book here, Refused to Be Done, which talks a little bit about his revision process is so over the top. I mean that with a lot
Yeah,
of not a criticism, but yeah,
I love it.
it's detailed.
Yeah, I
So,
think it's really great book.
yeah. So we're right here at the end, so I want to move to the final question we like to ask our guests, which is, what's one piece of craft advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
Mm, that's a great question. I think don't forget to be playful and try to stay in learning experimental mode as long as you can. Because you may have a passion project and that's great, but sometimes getting out of that comfort zone, approaching things like a beginner, trying things that you don't think you'll enjoy, you can actually learn a lot. From playing around with your projects. That could look like what we talked about earlier. Try it in 250 words. Try it in 5,000 words. But I think like be willing to let your work be playful and amorphous for a little longer, and don't jump ahead to what you think is the final polished version of it.
Well, Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing this book with all of us. If you don't have a copy yet, please get a copy from your local independent bookseller. You can also use the link online. We just put in the chat window. You can also go to your local library and ask them to get a copy. So please read this book, get a copy if you're able. Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. This was a great chat. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope we will stay in touch. And I'm looking forward to book number 2 and 3 and 4 and on indefinitely to the future.
Thank you so much, Zach, and thank you, the Writer Center, and everyone for being here.
Have a good night, everyone. We hope to see you again soon.